beginnings of everything, how we reached this point, or at least how we got started before we reached this point. Today, as we pick up in chapter 9, a couple of weeks ago we were concluding chapters 7 and 8 as it discussed the story or the details of the flood, how God had reached a breaking point in the sinfulness of mankind. God had reached a point in which He determined, and here's one of the things you're going to have to balance throughout, is that God has the capacity to have both full grace and mercy and full righteousness and truth working at the same time. And so grace and mercy can't overlook the fact that there's not any righteousness or truth among these people. And so the sinfulness then brings about a God response. God determines to respond to the sinfulness, the wickedness of mankind. When God chooses to respond, listen, His love and mercy that everybody, and His grace that everybody always wants to talk about, they want to act like these are the only characteristics God has. That He's a God of love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. And they want to lump all that in there and say that's all God is. But He is also a righteous God who will not tolerate sin forever. And He proved it in this Genesis account. We get approximately 1,500 years of human history, and God determines and speaks and declares that He is grieved. He has broken, His own heart is broken by the sinfulness and the wickedness of man. Not that He is surprised by it, but that He is bothered by it, and as a result, a righteous God who is full of truth and justice, He must punish sin. And so He determined to punish sin in the collective at that moment in time. A God that can bring judgment and wrath, He didn't stop being a God of love and grace and mercy. But He did put His wrath and His judgment above His grace and mercy momentarily. Meaning that the wiping out of the planet, He didn't eliminate the planet itself, but He rearranged it in every possible way. And He only showed grace and mercy to 8 human beings and a small percentage of the animal life on the planet. And so He put His judgment and His wrath and His requirement. See, God has a requirement of Himself to deal with sin. He cannot just ignore it. It must be dealt with. And so He temporarily placed His wrath and judgment above His grace and mercy, you might say. In that His wrath and judgment was more obvious. He was still being gracious and loving, it just wasn't as obvious. And God has a right to do that because He is the creator of all things. You say, well, is He schizophrenic? No, you would say that about a human, but He's not bipolar and He's not schizophrenic. He is God who can perfectly manage various aspects of His character. He can put certain aspects of His character on the largest display for as long as He chooses to, and then at the same time He could opt to place another aspect of His character on center stage for as long as He chooses to. And so the story of the flood is that God put His wrath and His judgment against sin on center stage for a period of time which was a little more than a calendar year. And then at the end of all that, having shown grace and mercy to Noah and his family and to the remaining animals that had been placed on the ark and allowed to ride to safety, then God stepped back from his wrath and judgment against sin and put his grace and mercy back on display. And that's where it is most of the time. And that is why most of the world believes that if there is a God, that he must be a kind and loving God to some degree, because he hasn't wiped us all out. Now, some of those very same people would then in the same sentence say, but I don't know why he lets some evil people on the planet and he doesn't eliminate all the bad stuff. So obviously, the character of God is always going to be questioned by the lesser vessel of humanity. We're never going to understand him in his fullness, but it is necessary that we study his character and that we understand the realities of his character, and that we put ourselves in the proper position to say, God, I don't understand how you manage these aspects of your character, but I trust you, even though I don't understand you. And see, the biggest problem for us as humanity is that we want God to explain himself more fully, and we want him to give a satisfactory answer. Don't just give us your answer because, that's what the Bible is. It's God's explanation of himself. And a lot of people look at that and say, well, this is not a good enough answer to suit us. It doesn't answer all of our questions, at least not the way that would please us. And a person who will never get around to humbling themselves and recognizing the massive, incredible reality of God and the tiny, almost nothingness of us. See, if we can't humble ourselves and say, God, you don't owe me an explanation any more than you've already given me. You actually didn't even owe me that, but you gave it to me, and I thank you for it. When's the last time you thanked God for what he did explain, as opposed to whining to God about what he hasn't made clear to you? And so thankfully, we get some good examples along the way. Noah is impressive to some degree, right? Because he was righteous in his behaviors. He recognized the reality of God and the smallness of himself, and therefore God considered him worthy of grace. He kept him and his family alive. It wasn't just because of Noah, but all of them were behaving in that manner. But Noah's not the hero of the story. There's only one who is the hero of the story, and that is God alone. At the end of chapter 8, when Noah and his family were able to leave the ark, they immediately built an altar and began to give the sacrifices that God had instructed them to give. Those sacrifices which started causing trouble back with Cain and Abel. Apparently Noah and his family were the few only people on the earth that were doing what God called them to do. They immediately went right back to doing it just as they had before, because they recognized the only reason we're still alive is because God saved us. Amen. It wasn't because we were good enough. It was because we had obeyed him and he did something he didn't have to do. He saved us. We couldn't have saved ourselves from this worldwide flood. So they built an altar, and God even acknowledges that the altar pleased him. It satisfied him to see his people recognize that they were still sinners. See, Noah and his family were still sinners, and they got off the boat still as sinners, and they were going to add more sinners to the world. But they recognized their sinfulness, and they recognized how desperately they needed God. And God said, that smells good to me. And that's what we see at the end of chapter 8. God now then, of his own decision making, he makes a declaration that I'll never flood the earth again even though I know that everything man thinks and wants to do from his earliest day is evil. I know that that gene is being passed on in every generation. They all just simply are sinners who want to do what they want to do. Even though I know that's still going to be true, I will never flood the earth again to destroy all living things in this manner. And so for as long as the earth exists, I'm going to give them daylight and dark. I'm going to give them the seasons. I'm going to give them warm and cold and opportunities for things to grow to sustain them. God initiated it all. He made man and all the creation in the first 6 days of creation. He did all of that in chapter 1 on his own. God wasn't forced to do it. God destroyed man and everything on the planet besides these few. He wasn't made to do it, but his character demanded that he do it, and he did it. And then God, knowing where this would eventually continue and go, God of his own decision making, there was nothing that Noah and his family could have forced God to do, but God in his mercy and his grace and his love began the process from his end. And all of us need to always acknowledge that everything good and perfect, as we studied in the book of James this morning, comes from above. And every good impulse or every good behavior or every righteous action, every time you ever did the right thing, it didn't come from within you, it came from God in you. Now let's begin in chapter 9. We're going to take a look here in chapter 9. First of all, we're going to see a series of things that God initiates that he's not made to do, but these are just common graces that God gives. These are common blessings that God hands out to basically all of humanity. Okay? Now, of course, there'll always be in this broken, fallen, sinful world, there's always going to be exceptions. But as a general rule, God delivers these blessings to everybody. Humanity receives the gift and the blessing and the grace of procreation. They can continue to bring life into the world. A second blessing or a second common grace, you don't have to live up to your end of the deal to be able to bring children into the world. You certainly don't have to have to do anything on your part. God just initiated this. He gave mankind prominence over the animal kingdom. Okay? Mankind possesses an ability to tame and to rule the animal kingdom in large order. Thirdly, he has provided for us in order to have sustenance and to be able to have food and shelter. God has provided common graces of provision. He's allowed his creation to serve his creation, right? The creation of the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom serves the human race. He's provided that. Now, he also gives, because he loves and cares, a God of grace and love and blessing will also give you prohibitions, meaning he will sometimes tell you things that are not for your own good, so don't do them. This will be for your benefit to follow his prohibitions when he prohibits or keeps you from doing something. And then finally, he has to lay out the possibility of the need for protection in order to suppress evil in some manner. God has laid out protection provisions in his word so that mankind can have some sense of safety, some idea that you can function in this life without fearing untimely an unnecessary death. You say, what is that? Well, we're going to get to it in just a second. So let's start with verse 1. This is going to be fairly straightforward here through these first 7 verses. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Hey, seems like we've heard that once before, right? Genesis chapter 1, he brought Adam into existence. From Adam, he also then created Eve, and he married them together. He didn't give them a choice, but he said, the two become one flesh, and one of their requirements or responsibilities was to be fruitful and multiply. Bring more humans upon the earth. God, listen, God created the first one. He created Adam out of the dust of the earth, and then he breathed life into his nostrils. And then God created Eve because Adam couldn't create Eve by himself. So God created Eve from Adam. And then from there, God handed the blessing of procreation into the hands of men and women. Did you ever think that maybe, God could have just kept making humans out of the dust of the earth and just keep populating the earth on his accord? But he handed to us the incredible blessing of intimacy that would be experienced only within the confines of a biblical marriage, which is only to be defined as one man and one woman. That's it. It's the only way marriage is defined. That's the only reality. And it would bring a blessing, a benefit of intimacy that would draw them together. And God not only used that intimate relationship to foster a stronger bond between relational creatures, but he also gave them the blessing, in most cases, that they could bring forth offspring. And nothing warms your soul like bringing one of your own into the world. Amen. What an incredible grace that God gave us. A blessing. The word blessing means to benefit or to be a benefit. The hand of God brings both intimacy and family as a common grace that can be experienced. Even if you don't ever acknowledge God, you can still be intimate with another human being, and you can bring forth, in most cases, you could bring forth a child and experience the incredible blessing of bringing forth an offspring. That's a blessing, a grace from God. Secondly, verse 2, he gave us prominence. All the animals of the earth, all the birds of the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I have placed them in your power. Mankind will have and has experienced, again, with noted exceptions, when wild animals get in contact with a human being and many times can bring about their death. But as a general rule, see, God's principles are general rules. They are not, hey, let's look for the exception to the rule when a woman can't have a child or when an animal kills a human. As a general rule, God grants us dominion and prominence over the animal kingdom. So that honestly, most of them are scared of us, even if some of us are sometimes scared of them. It causes us to keep a proper distance, right? We're not supposed to view them as human. We're certainly not supposed to have a level of relationship with them that would be reserved only for human beings. And so we are able to maintain a proper boundary between human relations and human and animal relations. Verses 3 and 4, God then also gives us the provision He uses the animals to provide for us. I have given them to you for food, just as I have given you grain and vegetables. Remember that God showed them when Adam and Eve realized that they were naked because they had sinned and they were now aware of their sinfulness. God said, those fig leaves, don't cut it. There's got to be an animal killed. The blood of the animal pays for your sins. It covers your sins. But also symbolically, you need to understand that the hide of that animal will be used for clothing so that you are appropriately covered. So these animals serve many purposes, and now we get the first declaration that you can be something other than a vegetarian. You're allowed to eat meat. That's God providing a common blessing for everyone. Again, notice this is God reaching down to us. Even after the devastating flood, God had the capacity to return grace and mercy to the picture, even after his wrath and judgment and his hatred towards sin. Verse 4 says, you are prohibited, but you must never eat any meat that still has the lifeblood in it. Not supposed to eat it raw. The blood was supposed to be spilled. The blood was always symbolic of the blood that would eventually be shed by Jesus on the cross. The blood was always symbolic as a pouring out, as a covering for sin. And so these animals that you kill, you don't eat them while they're still alive. You drain the blood. You learn how to use the fire that God showed them how to bring into play, and you cook it so that it's healthier. You kill off that which needs to be killed off, and it makes you healthier. And you don't end up drinking blood, and you don't end up worshiping the thing that is just simply there to provide for you. And verse 5 goes on to show us that God also had to protect us against untimely and unjustified death. Verse 5 says, and I will require the blood of anyone who takes another person's life. If a wild animal kills a person, it must die. And anyone who murders a fellow human must die. God invoked capital punishment. You might not be comfortable with it in this day and age. It really doesn't matter if you and I are comfortable with it or not. God invoked it. You say, well, there's so many ways in which we don't know if we've got the right person. I get it. If the complications of various trials make it very difficult for us to ever get to the bottom of a case and see who's truly guilty of murder. But when we know someone is guilty of murder, God has laid out for us the reality. When someone else decides to play God and end someone else's life in an unjustified manner, meaning that you are not in the heat of war or you are not in some method of self-defense, but you are simply choosing to end someone else's life on your terms by your decision making, then when that happens, then you must pay for your life with your life. That life that was taken must then also be paid for with yours. Some say, well, we're not sure that capital punishment really reduces the crime rate. I can promise you this. If a legitimate murderer is put to death, they will not become a repeat murderer. It does stop them from doing it again. You don't have repeat offenders in the world of homicide and murder. If justice is handed out appropriately as it should. God reiterates this in verse 6. Again, this is not Noah saying, hey, what should we do? This is God started all this whole conversation. God brought it all up. Verse 6, if anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. Now, the implication here, again, is that if anyone takes someone's life, meaning, again, the horrors of war and the real issue of potential self-defense would not be the same as taking someone's life in an unjustified manner. Okay? God says that person's life will then also be taken by human hands. Why? Because God made human beings in His own image. That's why the death penalty doesn't exist for human to animal. Now, I agree, it is cruel and unnecessary for humans to kill an animal. But you understand that humans outrank animals in God's design. They are not equal. And so God has said that even an animal killing an animal has to die, an animal killing a human has to die, and a human killing a human. If a human dies in an unjustified manner, then justice must be handed out. Why? Because humanity is God's crown jewel. They are made in the image of God. Nothing else is. And so again, God initiated all this, and He doesn't ask Noah what he thinks about it. He doesn't tell him to work on this for a while and get back to me with what you guys come up with. He simply lays it out for him. And it's actually meant to provide some level of security in which we can operate in our lives we shouldn't have to fear that we would be unnecessarily, unjustifiably, and untimely brought to death at the hands of another human being. Because we have real law enforcement that is supposed to bring justice upon a murderer when it's done correctly. And then, as if to turn the page and get back to happier thoughts, verse 7 simply says, now be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth. Okay, guys? That's what I gave you. I gave you lots of graces, and we had to cover some tough territory. But your responsibility and your great blessing is to get out there and repopulate the earth. I know you're going to bring more little sinners into the world. I know you're all going to think they're a little angel when they first get here. And I know if they live long enough, you're going to realize that even your little angel sins too. And yet God's okay with it all. Why? Well, because God is a God who does many, many things, but one of the things that God does is He saves people who don't deserve it. His covenants begin to reveal His character. He starts all this conversation, and now He's going to initiate a covenant very quickly through the next handful of verses that reveal His character and remind us of man's character, meaning God is perfect and man is far from it. So God is getting ready to voluntarily put Himself on the spot with an eternal covenant. Verses 8 and 9, we shift gears here. A covenant, a sign, and a summary is provided for us. Then God told Noah and his sons. So he said something else now after He told them all those other things. Verse 9, I hereby confirm my covenant with you and your descendants. That's incredible. God starts a promise that they didn't ask for, and God says, I'm going to initiate my covenant, my agreement, my promise to you, and this one, we're going to find out, is an unconditional promise, meaning God's already agreed He's going to do it whether you do the right thing or not. Now, sometimes God's covenants demand a proper response from us. But many of His covenants are unconditional, Meaning, even if you don't recognize what he's doing, even if you don't care about what he's doing, he makes the agreement essentially with himself. I've agreed within my own thinking that I'm going to do this for you and for your descendants. Now the rest of verse 10 goes on to say, and with all the animals that were on the boat with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, every living creature on earth, they're going to get to benefit from it too. My blessing is going to extend, and it's going to be primarily attached to the humanity on the planet, but all the rest of the creatures will get to benefit from it as well. Well, what will that be? Verse 11. Yes, God says again, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will floodwaters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. Now notice his language is precise. He didn't say the earth will last forever. And he didn't say that he wouldn't destroy by different means. And if you've been with me through the book of Revelation, you know he will destroy it all again, but not through floodwaters. So he is completely precise and accurate here. Never again will I do it this way. This is my covenant to you. This is not, if you do this, I promise not to do this. And so for 4,500 years now, God has held true to this promise. And it'll hold true till the end. Verse 12, then God said, I'm giving you a sign of my covenant. Again, Noah didn't ask for this. God makes a covenant. He reemphasizes it. Now he says, I'm going to give you a sign so that it'll strengthen your feeble little heart. I'm giving you a sign of my covenant with you and with all living creatures for all generations to come. There will be a perpetual reminder of God's covenant. Verse 13, I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. Just as a side note, any other organization that tries to use the rainbow, it's not theirs. He said it's my rainbow. It's got 7 colors in it. 7 is the number of completion. Many others try to hijack the rainbow, and they try to use 6 colors, the number of man. It's my rainbow. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. Look at all the times he says I and my throughout this passage. I'm going to give you a sign because you will probably forget and begin to think that I'm going to flood the earth again. When you see part of your territory starting to flood, you're going to think that I'm bringing the flood again. I mean, honestly, what was Noah's experience? His experience was, well, it's rained once. I've been alive 601 years. It's rained once, and it was pretty devastating. So the idea that it would ever rain again would be kind of frightening. God says, wait a minute. When you see this rainbow, it's going to remind you that the rain that's falling, the sun that's reflecting off those raindrops that's creating this rainbow, it's a reminder that it ain't ever going to be like this again. Verse 14, when I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds. And honestly, at some point in every moment of every day, somewhere on the planet, there's clouds. So this is essentially saying God will never, ever, ever forget his promise. And he just keeps saying it over and over again. Verse 15, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life. When he says, I will remember, that's not saying, well, I'm going to set a reminder. That is God vowing his faithfulness My pledge to you is that I will never forget this promise. And he has said it to us multiple times in these handful of verses. And he says it one more time for our benefit. Verse 16. When I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will remember the eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth. Every living creature, all they didn't have to do anything to get the benefit of this. God just promised to give it to them anyway. Verse 17, then God said to Noah, yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant. The covenant I am confirming with all the creatures on earth. He validates it over and over again. Make no mistake about it. Those who fear what mankind can do to the climate, I promise you, the climate changes that we experience are because God is sending them. And mankind does not have the strength or the capacity to override God and somehow create a global warming that melts the ice caps and causes the whole world to flood again. Nope. God has promised that's not going to be the case. Because if it was, then that would essentially mean that God created the planet, but He doesn't really control it. He absolutely does control it. So this first detailed covenant that we've looked at here, this is God's first detailed covenant with mankind. Now, His original, you could sort of call what happened in chapter 3 after the sin entered the picture, and God pronounced these various details of the curse of the fall. It's sort of a covenant, but this one, of course, is a covenant with many great benefits. The other one had a lot of negative to it. So this first covenant reminds us that every human who has ever lived was born a sinner. Okay? God dealt with it through the flood, and now for 4,500 years, He has held off His worldwide judgment of sin again. But we have no promise. We have no promises that He'll hold off another day. He could start again. He could start up His final judgment at any moment. God can't tolerate sin, yet God, in His mercy, because His nature also includes His desire to save, God makes a way to enter His presence, even though sinful humanity cannot ever be in His presence. There has to be an in-between. There has to be a mediator between us and God. And you know that to be Jesus Christ. God then always is the one making the first move. God always makes the first move regarding grace. You don't suddenly become worthy of grace. You don't eventually become worthy of grace. Mankind can never put God on the spot and demand that He respond in grace. Every measure of grace that we experience is because God initiated it Himself, and we are supposed to become more and more familiar with and overwhelmed by the greatness of a God who would initiate blessings. He would bring them to us of His own decision making. Just as God, in essence, lowered Himself to go find Adam in the garden after he had sinned. Remember, Adam was feeling pretty low. He was awfully ashamed. He wanted to hide behind a tree. He didn't want to see or talk to God. God came to him to bring about restoration. The same thing is true today. God came down low in the form of Jesus Christ. He humbled himself to the level of a servant and gave his life on the cross and rose again the third day, because God is always the one who makes the first step in initiating grace. God also makes his mercy available. He makes his mercy available as long as earth endures. He is sustaining the ecology of this planet. He is allowing life to continue. But when he decides time's up, time will be up. And when he decides that, there'll be no more advance warning. You'll not get an alert on your smartphone. You need to know the times right now. You need to be able to recognize the times as they exist right now. All of the warning that you are ever promised is contained in here. And when God determines to bring about his final wrath and judgment, there will be no more advance warning. Today is the day of salvation. Not later on, not when you feel like it, not when you get it all figured out. Today is the day of salvation, and now is the appointed time. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your blessing. Thank you for the boundless truth in your word. Thank you that we can take ancient history, so many years in the past, and still learn relevant lessons for today.